I think that's kind of whack.
You said it. I didn't say it.
So I think the designers that like stay in their lane, for lack of a better term, is like that's not what I wanted. That's like a false dichotomy, right? Like the world is far more squishy than that, or you don't have the mentality of like, that's not my job. The more effective you will be. The best junior people ask a lot of questions.
Hey folks, so this video is going to be a little bit different. I thought that it was about time that you heard perspectives about design from people who have deep experience in roles that work with design, because design is very collaborative. So for this video, I interviewed Ernie Park. He is a professional hyphenate. In other words, he has done a bunch of different things and he has done them extremely well. At his core though, he's an engineering leader. He built most of his career at Hubspot through his explosive growth from startup to global enterprise. He's now the founder of Part-Time Tech, which is a movement for fractional work in the tech industry. And this part doesn't really share very often because he's a little too humble, but he is a Y Combinator alum. But most importantly, I think he's just an overall good guy. I have had the pleasure of being his friend for quite a while now. And this conversation just was fun, insightful, wisdom-packed, and I truly think that it's going to help you design better and be a better designer. So enjoy. So Ernie, thanks for making the time for this. So just to set the stage a little bit, so my audience is largely like junior designers. Many are looking for their first role. Some are just starting out, but there's like a growing number of folks who are like, early stage, mid-level. So over time, the topics have kind of changed a little bit. And so we're getting a little deeper into, not just the craft side of it, but what does it mean to be a designer, a part of a team, and the business, and what does that look like and how does that work? So I'm actually really excited to have you on as a guest. You'll be our first guest, but I thought it made a lot of sense to kind of interview other folks who have a lot of experience to kind of share about, other roles that work alongside design and how that all kind of interplays. And I think this could be a series. We don't know. We'll see. But I just wanted to first give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience. So yeah, introduction, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. My name is Ernie Park, a longtime friend of Stuart's. I guess at least professionally, I was a CS grad, pretty traditional in that sense. I started a company right after college, but my heart wasn't really in it. So I kind of went more to traditional software engineering for a while. The bulk of my career was built at HubSpot. I was there over 7 years. First half as an individual contributor, kind of building various products, mostly on the front end. So obviously working a ton with designers, but I kind of spanned the full stack, did some internal tools, back-end stuff as well. The second half, I was kind of switching more towards a tech lead and then management track, leading teams. And I grew a bunch of our growth teams. So these were engineering and multidisciplinary product teams, focused on converting free users into paying customers. So we switched more to like a freemium model that you see a lot today in software companies. I also did a short stint at Brex as an engineering manager after HubSpot. But this was kind of done during the pandemic last year, but eventually decided to kind of step away from kind of full-time 9-to-5 work to kind of find myself and do some new things. Try to become an entrepreneur, start a farm, and all sorts of crazy things, which maybe we can get more into later.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Thanks for that. Okay, so I'd love to start with kind of your story around like a peak collaboration moment with a designer, and maybe if you could talk to like different types of designers you've worked with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favorite people that I've worked with, I won't name her name in case she doesn't want to be blasted in public, but maybe, when I was a tech lead on our growth teams, so a tech lead is both an individual contributor and a manager of like a very small team of like 4 or 5 engineers. But she was kind of my designer alongside of me, along with a product manager. So we were considered the triad, is sort of, and we kind of helped set direction for the team and all that sort of a thing. I don't know if there's any one moment, but I think just that relationship was so good. Not because necessarily like she was what I would say like the best designer, even though she was an excellent designer. It was more just that I think collectively we all understood what the goals of our team were and what we were doing for the business and for our users. So with that kind of common ground, every conversation was like very deep. And we got really kind of to the meat of problems, right? It was never like, hey, what should this look like? It was always, what problem are we solving? like what metrics are we driving? How can we implement this? And then we have like a good collaborative discussion on like how engineering and design can actually work to achieve those outcomes. So, maybe that's not the answer you were expecting, but like for me, it was less about like, hey, we're working and we're building this thing. It was more just always being aligned on knowing where kind of we're going together, and understanding those business goals.
And was this when you were an IC or both as an IC and as
I was like
a
kind of
leader?
hybrid, and then eventually became more just a manager. But I think it applied like at least functionally what I was doing, both as an IC and as sort of like a manager, I guess.
So if we were to look on the other side of it, would you be comfortable sharing like maybe difficult collaboration scenarios with
Mhm.
designers?
Yeah, I think generally I was pretty fortunate to mostly work with really good designers. But I think the times where it's not as good is, maybe this is like a really the obvious answer to give, but I guess it's like the converse of what I just described, right? Where it's like
Mm.
design thinks their role is to like make mock-ups and wireframes and interactions. And that's just like to me, that's just the medium through which you achieve like the goal, right? It's when there's less collaboration on like, what should we even build in the first place, right? Like, what are the problems the users are having? What are the problems our business is having? When there's less discussion about that and alignment on that, in my opinion, like you might be missing the mark entirely, even if you design something that's really pretty or like works
Mhm.
really well. So I think the designers that like stay in their lane, for lack of a better term, is like that's not what I wanted, right? I wanted people I could really work deeply with, and solve problems with. And then, maybe to give like an analogy, it's like, the iceberg analogy, right? Like there's like a bunch of stuff under the surface, it's a little bit on top. Like in a sense, like everyone working on a product team, I would say like you're all kind of under the surface working, like doing the same things. You're solving problems, understanding users. And then just like that, the stuff you see on the surface is like the way that your role manifests differently. So as an engineer, you obviously write code, and build stuff. As a designer, you're, doing mocks, interactions, talking to users, that sort of a thing. But I think the bulk of it is like, no, we're solving problems kind of together, and really understanding what we're trying to do. So.
I can't help but think that that makes it more complicated because the
Mm-hmm.
boundaries are not there. So could we
Mm-hmm.
could we talk about, okay, so common maybe misunderstandings that engineers and maybe designers have? I know PMs are part of the mix, but let's just talk about
Sure.
engineers and
Yep.
designers.
That's a great point, and I think that can happen for sure. I think I think on that team I was in a situation where everyone kind of was very business minded and user minded, so there was a ton of overlap, and I think that was very healthy. In terms of boundaries, I think definitely that can happen. Like I'm not going to go as an engineer or leading a team do like 20 user calls, right? Like that's just not practical. And I think in some ways it was like pretty obvious where some of those lines were. Like the PM will go kind of do more discussions with the business, and sorry, you said not talk about PMs, but I'll talk about money. Designer will go talk to users, or maybe they'll gather other sorts of feedback that are kind of more pertinent to the UX. And engineers will obviously like look at bugs, kind of technical issues, things like that. So I think some of those boundaries are pretty obvious. I think where you can kind of spell where maybe it could get muddier, I think it's really just about, and these are fluffy answers because I think these are sort of fluffy things, but it's like you just have to have good forms of communication, right? And know
Mm.
how you can kind of check in. So like that group, like yes, we had like a weekly check-in, but it's like we're constantly talking, right? So it's like, what are the goals we're trying to do? Like, okay, who's going to go do this thing so that we better understand this problem or whatever. So yeah, I think some of it kind of falls into shape by knowing your roles. But I think if it does get kind of confusing, or it feels like, hey, like that's really my, the designer's role, like, you don't need to do that. I think you kind of just got to be upfront and kind of spell it out. But obviously from a place of like, hey, we're all trying to go towards the same thing, but like, how can we make sure we define those roles a little better? The other thing I'd say too is like, I feel like if you're doing your job as say like an engineering manager or as like a designer, like you're
Yeah.
not going to have time to do the other person's job usually.
Yeah, like a lot of questions that I get are around that. So like I
Mm.
think on some level they're like, okay, it's fuzzy, I get it. Um are there like things you think you can point out as tactics
Mm-hmm.
in like forming relationships or making that collaboration a little bit better? You kind of touched on it with like
Yeah, yeah.
communication, but if there's anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, so I mean, I could definitely dive a little deeper into what that means. I think one thing I remember from, anytime you get a new team member, whether design or not, it's uh, you want to kind of meet with everybody on the team and like develop that relationship, just like personally, but then also really talk about like, hey, when I've met with designers, like really good ones can come and say like, hey, here's what I like to do. Here's how I like to work. How do you like to work? Right. Here are kind of where my skills are. Here's like where I'm not as strong. I think having that sort of expectation setting meeting, and just like leveling is really important because I think it puts you on the same page. Um, like for instance, actually, so from my perspective, one thing I tell designers is like, hey, I'm like the least pixel perfect person in the world. I'm actually like very approximate and I'm not very good, let's say like visually, right? Like I care about the experience, but I'm like bad at CSS. I'm like pretty sloppy with these things. I definitely lean on team members who are better at it, but like my attention to detail is not there. So if there's something important to you that I'm missing because I just like did like, let me know. Right. Or like, hey, I want to lean on you, designer, to like fill this gap, or here's something I want to do to help you. Right. I think having that sort of a conversation up front um, makes explicit different parts of the relationship so that if there is an issue in the future, it's like, hey, we already talked about this. So it's not as like weird for me to bring it up if there's a problem.
Couple of things there, right? One is like, Ernie, you just strike me as like a person who can be humble like that.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes wonder, and this has been a conversation with like some other designers too, where does it have to be upstream where you hire for that kind of quality, or can like even a junior designer like just be, they're good at what they do, but they haven't quite like gotten that work experience yet? Like, can they hop in and can they learn to do all that?
I think it definitely is harder early in your career because I think that kind of a thing definitely like scales with confidence, right?
Yeah.
But I think I've actually seen. So I'm going to answer this from my perspective, leading engineers, but I don't think it's any different for designers, right? Because
Yeah.
the way I led my teams, I kind of expected everyone to have like a certain baseline of like problem solving and like problem solving ability and like ability to understand the user and our product and all that sort of a thing. So I've seen interns come in and have that exact quality, and they were very bold. They asked questions, and like, fortunately, I think we had a team environment where no one was like, who are you? You're an intern. Like, shut up, right? There's none of that, right? So, um, I don't think it matters like the level of experience. Like, certainly, it requires like some bit of like self confidence, but I think you know, and obviously, like your environment has to be right such that like it's like safe to ask questions or poke or prod or be like challenge. Um, but that being said, like I think that's like one of the strongest qualities you can see in like more junior engineers and designers, right? Like, or just anybody is like, can you ask really good questions? In fact, I actually just wrote an article for something else more engineering related, but like the best junior people ask a lot of questions, and sometimes it's usually the instinct is to like retreat to imposter syndrome. It's like, if I don't ask any questions, no one will know, like, I don't know what the heck is going on. Right. But it's actually the opposite. Can you like poke? Can you prod? Can you be like, hey, like, why are we doing it this way? Like, I just want to understand. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can really help build people's confidence as well as cement your place on a team as somebody who's very inquisitive, who's thinking, right. And kind of challenging. So, yeah, I don't think the experience level matters. Anybody can do it, but definitely requires some confidence and like building yourself up to get to that point.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point. Yeah, sometimes we talk about how like design and I guess other tech roles too. It's like I feel like we're in the business of asking questions and getting
Mm-hmm.
feedback,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and sometimes like how difficult that is because sometimes in those meetings, especially with like broader stakeholders, like I think that fear and anxiety could overtake you, and you just
Yeah.
stay quiet until you like know everything. Um, yeah, and to break through that could be tricky. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll try to put a link to your article too, because
Mm-hmm.
if there's parallels there, I think my audience could
Yeah, I
benefit
certainly think there
from
could
it.
be. The one thing I'll just add there to what you said, the one good thing about like kind of this more remote and asynchronous world is like it's not necessarily just dominated by the person who can speak up loudest in a meeting. Like obviously there's still Zoom meetings and sometimes it can be
Mhm.
hard to like raise your hand. But if you're not as good speaking up in an in-person meeting or in Zoom meeting or whatever, like you can throw a message in Slack or Teams or chat or whatever, right? There are different mediums of communication that we have, and some people are better on, some mediums than others, and that's okay.
The fact that like some of what we're talking about can be seen as like cliche, it's just what people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an understanding that if we work this way, the end outcome of the product or the business will be better.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I also benefit from like going into tech at the time I did. So this was kind of what people were saying and doing. So it was easier to kind of go along with it and also espouse it. But in your experience, do you think you could recall moments where working this way actually resulted in something better?
This is a huge reason why I think my teams had a ton of success at HubSpot. We were basically a small team of like a couple of people. The part of the business that we owned was very, very tiny. And by the time I left, it was like a huge, significant, like, double-digit percentage of like the business driven. And I don't think, and this is like especially pertinent to like where we were sitting in growth, which is extremely interdisciplinary. But I don't think it's possible without like the combination of like business understanding, user understanding, and like extremely good products. I think there are times probably where you can like get away with not being good at one of those things. If you just like built a really good experience and then like, oh, it actually like it just worked, right? And like people came, but like in growth, especially like there's a lot of measurement. There's a lot of instrumentation that needs to be done on the engineering side. There's a lot of like actual like A/B experimentation. There's a lot of talking to users to be like, are we even like in the right ballpark of like problem solving right now? And then there's like a lot of like, is this even the business problem we want to solve? Does this move the needle at all for like the business, right? I think if we didn't have a really good collaboration between engineering and design, we wouldn't have had the success that we would have had.
Yeah, and like I know that HubSpot was like particularly like metrics driven company.
Mm-hmm.
All right, just to play the other side a little bit.
Yeah.
There is a school of thought, especially in the design world, where like sure you can measure things, but if you want to innovate, there needs to be some level of like going with gut feeling or intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Like how did you kind of like manage that, or how did that play into your guys' thinking?
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about that designer again. I have the perfect example for this, and I don't think it has to be an either or kind of a thing, right? It's like it's using the right thing at the right time. We were experimenting a ton on our pricing page, so that was one of the things that we owned. And for a big company like HubSpot that drives a ton of visitors and leads, like your pricing page is like hugely influential to your business. We did a ton of experiments around optimizing different things, helping people understand different parts that would convert better, changing copy, changing designs, navigation here, information architecture, this and that. And at a certain point, we started getting diminishing returns, and we were measuring all the way, right? We were doing A/B tests, checking significant, all that sorts of stuff. At a certain point, with the combination of design and research and engineering and product, and the designers were the loudest saying, hey, like, I think fundamentally this is not solving the right problems. And like, we need to like, we're at like a local maximum. We need a complete redesign to reimagine what this page is if we're going to see any more increases here. So I think that's a place where like, the other thing where like, it's not just that it's gut feeling, like gut feeling usually comes from somewhere, right? It's not just like, like I would even say like intuition is not some like thing that just exists in your brain. Like it's tied to other things, right? It's tied to data you've seen before. It's tied to the users you've talked to. It's tied to experiments you've run and like stuff you've built. So I think that intuition is built over time from different inputs, and that can drive future decisions. So certainly, I guess to your point, like not everything can be measured, but like they're inputs and that you can use to make certain decisions. So I don't think they necessarily have to be at odds with each other. And you just have to know when to say like, hey, is this data like, are we doing this because of data, or like it's just like another input, and then we have a strong bet we want to place based on some of the other information we have?
Oh man, that's so good. You know what? I don't think I really thought about it that way. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
And then it comes down to, does the team trust your, I guess, quote unquote intuition and your gut feel? Oh, okay. Wow. That was like a breakthrough for me.
Yeah. And I think, I think the whole like data versus like intuition or that's like a false dichotomy, right? Like the world
Mhm.
is far more squishy than that, and like the way you work is far more squishy than that. And sometimes you just got to make a call and go with it, and that's okay. And then obviously there's like human factors and politics and other things involved. Um, but I think the best teams can like align also on like how you're using different qualitative and quantitative data, right? And
Yeah.
that's why like if it was just quantitative, then like you can get machines to like do everything for you, right? But there is like a dose of subjectivity and gathering qualitative feedback and like incorporating that to develop what is an intuition, right? So
Okay, so I'm sure you're familiar with this. Like with any team, right? There's always like that forming and norming period. So when you're talking about like that peak, experience you had with the designer, was there a forming period and what did that look like?
for this designer in particular, I think just having someone that you can collaborate with and see eye to eye on that alignment was like big. And I think after the first couple things we did together, it was clear that we had that sort of chemistry as a team. And I think just like delivering results like goes a long way, right? In building trust, like at the end of the
Fair.
day, right? So like it helps that like we had some wins.
Hmm.
And I also don't want to understate like the importance. Like I think we did a lot of good work, but at the same time, it's like we were also at a point in like HubSpot as a whole and like the macro economy as a whole where a lot of things were going up. Now, I don't think it would have just happened if we didn't do any work. But I think the point of what I'm trying to get across is like success helps teams feel better, right? And like work better and like gel. It's sort of like what people say in like sports, like winning cures kind of all faults and like problems, right? So that's sort of like I think there was like a bit of that too, but
Are there some ways that UX designers or product designers can add more value to engineers or be a bit more helpful? And these are things kind of like if they did this a little bit differently or if they knew about this, I think maybe this could help.
I think I can enter in two ways. Like I feel like this is what I typically tell like earlier ish designers. Like one is like understanding what the product development and engineering cycle looks like. So like you don't have to be an engineer, but like understand how software gets developed and tested and deployed at your company and understand that cycle well. I think once you understand that, you as a designer can also better understand where you can be the most helpful and like how you fit into that process. Designers are going to fit into the engineering process usually, and it's not the other way around. Um, just because there's like a lot more tooling and like writing code like it's slower typically and like other stuff. So I think figure that out. Like a concrete example is like at what stage like do you need to test things like as a designer? So let's say like we're working together, you give me a mock, my team or me like and I build it, I like put up a pull request on GitHub. Like do you test it there? Like is there like a staging environment for you to look at it? Like what's the right point for feedback? And am I looking for pixel perfect feedback or am I looking for like, hey, is this like in the ballpark of like what you're imagining, right? I think understanding for designers to like understand that process and also have inputs. Like don't just like, yes, you probably got to fit into that process, but like don't just like assume it's like perfect, right? Like figure out what works well for you to deliver like the best experience and product possible. And the other piece there too, I would say is, one of the big values of like really strong engineering teams is like how fast is your feedback cycle? How fast can you ship things and then like get feedback and iterate and improve? And I think that's no different for design as well, right? Like how fast can you get feedback on your design? Like, and bonus points if it's real users and real customers. So the more you can work closely with engineering to understand the process, like kind of the nuts and bolts of that, the better you can get feedback and faster feedback as well.
When you're looking for that fast feedback cycle, like what is the engineer thinking about? Like what are they trying to hedge against?
Mm.
Or what are they trying to achieve by ensuring that the feedback's happening at the right time?
I think as an engineer, you don't want to waste your time writing code that isn't what you intended, right? Or designing experiences. So, I go back to it, but it's like alignment. It's like, is this what you imagined? Right. And maybe some of this, right, is what I would recommend is like, before you even touch the keyboard and write a line of code as an engineer, it's like, you should meet up and like understand the mock, right? Like ideally, depending on what project management or like meetings or whatever you have, however you communicate, like you shouldn't pick up a mock and start writing until you like understand not just like what it looks like, but like intent as well, right? So I think as an engineer, what you're looking for is like, am I doing the right thing? Am I building the right thing? And am I actually putting into code and production the actual thing that we like spent a lot of time and effort on? And I've definitely seen many times where like that checkpoint happens too late and I just wasted 2 days, because a lot of things can get lost in translation, right? From like, I don't know, like Figma to like actual website or whatever you're building, right? So it's just making sure in that translation, like you're constantly checking in and like have the right like checkpoints there so you're not wasting any work.
So we could go into our audience asks portion. These are from some mentees I work with at Design Lab. They wanted to stay anonymous. But this is a cause of some anxiety, but I thought it would help to get answers from you. They ask, do I need to code to gain credibility with engineers?
No. And I think if you have an engineer that thinks that, I think that's kind of whack. Frankly. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think you should be a good designer and add value to the team with the skills that you have.
You folks who are listening, there you have it. You got the answer.
I will say though, I'll add a little more nuance to it. I don't think you need to code, but I think the ability to like, one, you have to know how to use your product, obviously. And like if we're talking about, I'm just going to use the example of web stuff. That's mostly what I've done, but I think you can kind of translate it to other domains or mediums or whatever. Like as a designer, like you should be able to like open up the Chrome inspector or like whatever, Mozilla Firefox, whatever, and like move stuff around and like, muck with the CS, like change a value, right? A color, like whatever, like these, I think there are like a lot of like little things like that make you far more effective. And you should just not only be a master of like your design tools, but like other tools that can like help product development move faster. The more you have the mentality of, or you don't have the mentality of like, that's not my job, the more effective you will be. But as a designer, you don't need to write code.
Oh, I think that's tweetable right there. That's a good quote. No, I think you're right. Yeah. Because it lends itself to like empathy, just trying to understand a little bit more about what, y'all might be going through.
Yeah.
And like, I always tell them like, I write code only my mom could appreciate. Like, I'm pretty terrible, but like, I just know enough to like inform maybe the designs, but beyond that, like I'm pretty lost. But it's definitely been helpful.
I'll just add to one more thing, and maybe I'm projecting now. But like, I feel like where that question could be coming from is I feel like there is this sort of implicit dynamic a lot of times on teams where like the engineers are higher on the totem pole than the designer, whether right or wrong. But like I've definitely experienced it myself and I see it. And so I think a lot of times designers have this kind of chip on their shoulder, like they're not technical, right? So like, how do you like gain your way on the team with all like the cool nerdy engineers? But in my mind, like I think stick to what you do well and like really lean into what you're good at and find ways to just be helpful through those things. And I think you'll build rapport with your team.
Oh, that's good. No, I think you're right. Yeah. This is from Efren from Twitter. I actually work with Efren. So I think I understand the question. I'll just read it and then rephrase it. So he asks, from an implementation standpoint, are there common ways you've noticed designers tend to structure a solution or a handoff, but it doesn't quite jive with how engineers might approach it? So in other words, I think what he's asking is like, are there ways for UX designers to be more effective in communicating their designs or vision and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's funny because I think this answer would have been like different like 7 years ago to now with like at least, and I'm giving this from the perspective of like web apps, but again, like translate it to whatever medium you have. I think the most important thing is speak the language that the code and design system is based in. So like now that there are design systems, like it's becoming more of a thing, right? In the past, like at least when I started, like even 10 years ago, like design systems were far weaker. It was still just like slinging CSS that sort of looks the same, right? So like designs were very difficult and very more freeform. I think these days there are a lot more design systems and like, fixed components, and like people have like, are you looking at like engineers and designers are looking at the same libraries, right? So it's like, you're not just saying like, hey, like do some search bar and like make it look purple. It's, hey, use like search bar 3, right? And like use these parameters, right? So I think, using kind of the common like design system is probably the most important thing, I would say, at least in terms of like visually. And if your company doesn't have that, I think that's probably the biggest investment to be made. Cause then you're speaking the same language, right? You're looking at the same components, and tools and things visually. I would say more to make that a little more general though, because not everyone works in this exact domain, I guess, like of web apps or like with React apps and components and things like that. It's just finding a way to have like a common language with your engineers so that they're not left guessing what you meant from a handoff. So, whether that means like literally explicitly putting down numbers, and I'm sure like Figma or like, other tools do some of this stuff for you, but like whether that means explicitly giving like margins and like numbers and things like that. Or, even zooming out, like if you're not as concerned with the pixel perfection of something, it's saying like, here's like my intention, right? Here's like what's important. Like this interaction is important. Exactly the way you draw it or whatever, like isn't as important. So yeah, hopefully that kind of helps. I think when there's ambiguity and you let an engineer figure it out, like that's where you can get into trouble.
You said it. I didn't say it.
Yeah.
Too funny. Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks for that. I'm trying to think, like, should I do this other question? You kind of already answered it, so I don't want to. Although I kind of want to give a shout out to Kevin Wang because he did like put in a question for me. So,
Just do it.
All right. Maybe we could go a little deeper because I'm pretty sure the person who asked Kevin is probably looking for like specific tactics, but we'll see if we can. Although what we talked about, like we said, is fuzzy and squishy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So he said or asked, what are some common problems you run into when working with a designer? What advice do you give to designers for a better designer developer collaboration? So you kind of talked about it. Mm-hmm. If there's anything that bubbles up as like, a specific tactic, which I think this question is gearing towards.
Yeah, I think I'll answer this in kind of two ways. One is like a very specific, like in the weeds kind of a thing, and one is like more broadly. And yeah, I did answer this in sort of different ways, but I would say like a more specific thing is like if a designer is not like kind of conveying like intention as well as like design, right? Like just like a visual, like I think that misses the mark, right? Like I've maybe said before, like, a design, a mock, like a UX is like the outcome of like understanding a user, a pain point, a problem or job to be done. So I think making sure that like you are owning that as a designer and like sharing that with engineers, I think that's really important. And I think losing that, like, I think it's very easy to think that the job is like just visual when it's obviously not. So I think that's one thing. And then I guess more broadly, I guess I sort of answered both of them at the same time, but more broadly, making sure that you understand that like that is your job, is to like understand those problems and like evangelize those things to engineers. I think the best designers I've worked with like are truly like voices of the customer, like, and PMs have that too. But designers have like a slightly, I think sometimes like a more nuanced view of that. But yeah, you're sort of like the voice of the customer, like the user and their pain points, and like finding the right way to convey that to engineers so that they feel it also will help influence kind of their decisions and how they think about problems.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, thanks for digging deeper there. You said all that stuff in multiple ways, but I think that was really helpful to phrase it that way. Yeah, because I always felt kind of like a terrible person for like giving this type of feedback to some folks, but yeah, I'll come across like case studies where it's like, wow, or like presentation where like, oh, it looks great, but so what? Or like why? And like I couldn't figure out like a better way to convey that. I mean, I've gotten better over time, but it kind of does come down to that. It's like, yeah, I could tell you're a great designer from like a pixel standpoint, but like in terms of a product standpoint, does this make sense? Like, should we do it? And then that's tricky because sometimes I feel like it's unfair to ask of that of more junior folks or who are starting out, but maybe we should be more okay of like pushing for that.
Yeah, definitely. One thing, an idea I've been noodling on recently, like this maybe would make a good tweet or something, is like when you come to like a product that you absolutely hate using, but it's been around, that's like a sign like, and like has like the worst design you think, and like all this, like that design is actually probably a really good product that has really good product market fit, because it's solving whatever problem someone has like super well. Or like, oh my goodness, how can they not have this feature, right? It's like the iPhone didn't have copy paste for like, 10 years. Like how can you not do that? And it's like, because they really understood what problems they were solving. It's either that or it's a new company and it's going to fold really quick. but for products or like companies that have been around a long time, that means they like really got to kind of the core of like, what is like the main problem or like the main thing we're trying to do here. And they did that one thing well.
Oh man, that's so good. Because it's true. Like I have a few examples already, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like they're solving the problem. It's working. I mean, sure, there could be improvements there, but clearly, like it's solving something, so it has
Yeah.
this like staying power. And end of the day, I suppose that's the end goal. So, and sometimes for designers, that's hard to kind of swallow. Or like designers
Yeah.
try to look for companies or teams where like design is the core
Mm,
business approach,
right.
which it's tricky. I actually tend to think like nowadays, like a lot of that has been covered. So like you notice a lot of folks going into more of the boring businesses,
Mm-hmm.
to solve stuff there. But yeah, that's an example too of like things that are solving problems. So it has staying power, but clearly like you could probably do it better, scale it better, make it more efficient, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, look, most of the jobs are in like B2B software, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think there's something to be said about like the like consumerification and like making, enterprise software more consumer grade in terms of its like friendliness and usability and all that. But like at the same time, like, look, there's like multi-billion-dollar businesses that look like crap or pain to use, but I'm not saying that those things shouldn't become better to use, right? But it's like, there are probably designers there who like really understand their core market. And it's like, I'm not going to solve this and I am going to solve this, right? Like, so I think there's probably some bit of awareness of like what is important to your company and like your user base. Cause you might not be building the next iPhone, right? It might not be pretty, but, and you're like within the constraints of some ugly and like hacky thing, but like maybe that's okay for your business, right?
Getting close to about time to let you go, but I definitely wanted to talk about what you're up to now. Just on a more personal note, I think it's just been amazing to kind of watch you like do the stuff that you're doing now, like the farm. Like you've been talking about doing your own thing too, and now you're like the founder of Part Time Tech. And I could tell not only are you prolific, but like people are really like catching on to it. And I've even like shared it with some folks at work because some people have decided to go part time, and I think they were looking at your resource. So yeah, I don't know where to start here. I just want us to talk about it, and then also I want to end with like leaving people a place to like find you and all that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe the best place to start is like kind of how I got here. So, as you know, like I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a really long time. And then during the pandemic, we decided to move back to New Jersey, where my family is. And, remote work came with that. I think it was fine initially, but for me, I'm just like a person who, I'm super extroverted. I need to see people, and just Zoom work just like was not working for me. The thing I always tell people is like, I was putting energy into the screen and it was not coming back out. Right. So I just like needed to kind of like take a break. And, I will say, worth mentioning, like very fortunate to be in the position to do that. And like my wife works, and like obviously not something everyone can kind of just do on the drop of a hat. So I recognize that. But yeah, like I think I've never like super bought into the idea that like I have to be like keep rising and climbing the ladder and like grind, 80-hour weeks and whatever. Like I enjoy working and I've enjoyed my career, but like that was never the most important thing for me. So for me, like finding ways to like just do what I want to do, to volunteer, to spend more time with my kids, my parents, family, like all that like was way more important to me, and to have that flexibility, and something I've been thinking about for a long time, but I finally like got the courage to kind of do it. So I did like some hourly work for the company that I had left. They just kind of extended that to me, which was cool. And then I recently did an interim head of engineering role. I did it fractionally. So I was doing like 10 hours a week. It was awesome. I got to help a startup, and I wouldn't have worked for them otherwise because I was not ready to go back to a 9 to 5. But I was like, hey, 10 hours a week, and I think I can help them. And I did like a 6-month engagement there, and I helped them find their next hire and help kind of shore up their teams. So I've always kind of been like, part-time work like makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. It doesn't have to be the thing you do always, but like in different times, like, hey, you had a kid, or like, hey, I just want to work on different things, volunteer, or you want to work more on top of your full-time job, whatever it might be. So I just wrote about it online and put it out in like a newsletter. It got some like decent traction. So I decided to just keep writing about it. I think it really resonates with like kind of the times, right? Like post COVID, people are kind of exhausted. There's layoffs. People are losing trust in like institutions, like big corporations, and like wanting to find a different way to do things, and sort of like finding themselves, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of where it started. And I've just been writing about it in my newsletter, and now also really like talking more from the company perspective as well, of like, hey, actually, like you can get really good talent that you might not be able to get otherwise because they'd rather work part time, or like, hey, I'm sure like when you have kids, it's like really freaking hard, especially for moms. And for moms, like a lot of times the option is like either you keep working full time and hopefully make enough to send your kid to daycare, or you just quit and then like, what the heck? Like I built this career and now it's like gone, and I feel like it's going to be hard to go back in like 6 years, right? So to me, like it's not just like, oh, this is fun and I get to like do other stuff, but part-time work is like really important to me because I think that's like the kind of lives a lot of people want to live, right? Where the kind of tagline I've said is like, make work fit around your life, not life fit around your work. Right.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's what I'm really trying to do. And like everyone can like take that to mean what it is, right? Like everyone's it just opens up flexibility so you can do what's important to you. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of part-time tech. I'll see where it takes me, but you can find out it's just parttimetech.io. It's like a newsletter you can subscribe to if that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you're underselling yourself. So there's a website. You could subscribe to the newsletters. There's YouTube. And do you also have a podcast outlet?
Yeah. So yeah, I've done a couple of interviews. So I put them up on YouTube and as a podcast.
Yeah. And I know your main audience are engineers, but every time I listen to your stuff, I see the crossover to designers, and I think that conversation's already happening. So yeah, if you're watching this and you're a designer, I think you should still check it out. He's also interviewed like PMs who are doing part-time work too. So we're all in the same universe together. So yeah, go check it out.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, obviously like my bias is towards engineering stuff, but I've intentionally sort of kept it broad because like you said, it applies to anybody in sort of any role. Obviously there are nuances to like different types of jobs. But yeah, it's part-time tech, not part-time engineering. So
Cool. All right. Well, Ernie, thanks a lot. I appreciate you. I respect you. I'm getting a lot of inspiration from you too. So I appreciate you making the time.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Stuart. Love what you're doing.
Hey, so I hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope you found it helpful. This is a new format for me for this channel. If you really liked it and you want me to interview other people, please let me know in the comments below and I'll try to make it happen. And of course, like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. But most importantly, if you think this video is going to help someone else, please do share it. I'll put the video of the next one that you probably should check out somewhere here. I'll see you in the next one.